Is it possible to achieve the very theme of the conference? Students? Now be, very active, participants, especially after the presentation of two speakers. That's what, we shared like that. I spoke to both the presenters. We have, fixed like this, there will be 3:2. Two presenters will take time and one participant for you to raise questions after the two presentations are over. So please reserve your question to raise the questions which are relevant and appropriate to the topic which are going to be presented. Okay, because being a young audience, about the kind of the current scenario in the country, especially all of you, I heard that some of you from criminology as well as legal background. Definitely you may have question when we are discussing about gender justice, particularly in the context of Bilkis Bano's case, the recent release of 11 life convicts. Please reserve your question after the presentation of the themes given to the speakers. Okay, the question you are not yet, responded. Is it possible to achieve the very theme of the conference? Yes, it is possible. How? I put it very simply, not, discussing because so many, things have already been addressed to you as part of the inaugural session. I don't want to repeat all that. Okay. The theme is, women participation, representation and empowerment. The two things are happening very much here. What are the two things? What are the two things? The first two things are already, taking place. It is in the process. What is that? You are participating, already it is there, and you are representing your own family, the neighborhood, the largest society you are representing. Okay, by way of, acquiring knowledge after the presentation, listening to the various speakers, you will acquire knowledge, okay, which you are going to disseminate to the family, your neighborhood, and the larger society. Okay, the dissemination of knowledge would result in emancipation. That is nothing but empowerment. You are empowering people through your knowledge. Okay, so that is what it is. Very much achievable, all the things in the theme. Please listen to the speakers. Okay, take down the notes. Okay, raise question after the two speakers have completed their task of presenting in the given theme. Is that right? Okay. And please raise question. I think speeches will be both bilingual, both in English as well as Tamil. So don't have any hesitation in raising question. So you can raise either in Tamil or in English, as you like. Please, while raising question, address to the speaker to whom you are addressing your question. Is that okay? Fine. So with this, now I'll invite first Professor Anandi. Okay, Madam is going to make a presentation, the very vital topic. Okay, gender and politics, a question of representation. Please, Madam.
Thank you for this opportunity to be here. Among probably the first time I'm seeing the youngest crowd in large numbers, because I work in the research institute in a very isolated way with very few students. So this is a very interesting experience. Partly, I just hope to be both speaking in Tamil and English, but as far as the technical discussion, I think I will confine to most of my presentation in English. Apologies for that. But before that, I just wanted to start with what the chair was just saying. How do we really look at this three terms, participation, representation and empowerment? Looks very complex term, isn't it? And also, it looks like you're all very young crowd here. We know fully well that your engagement with politics is slightly different from the older generation like ours. Why? Because I do see your presence in politics. You have a voting right, definitely. And you also have ways of representing yourself, not necessarily only through the formal politics, the electoral politics per se, but there is politics, the way in which you present yourself in social media and in various other newly technologically available digital forums to exercise your freedom, choice and rights, which is very, very important, and probably I'm not able to completely comprehend what it means to exercise rights through those forums. What I'm going to deal with today is about formal politics and the nature of women's participation, of course, but I want to tell you that in the morning sessions, I'm not very critical. Of course, I'm very much appreciative of what happens in Tamil Nadu because this is the model state. This is a Dravidian model state, definitely, in terms of its achievement. But what I also noticed is that we have a way of enlisting our achievements. We have a way of recalling a successful story in 10 minutes, in 5 minutes. Obviously, there is lack of time here to record the entire complex histories. But history is not linear. It's a very complex history. And women's participation, when we say, it's easy to list the name of participants. But what they did in history is a very complex narrative. Lot of struggles, very protracted struggles, lot of weaknesses, successes. All of them are not necessarily related to a full consciousness of political participation. Because we are all social beings. We are constrained by the society in which we live. How we render our services are constrained by our society. How do we live in this society? By and large, what is ignored is that much of our life in this society is lived as men and women. But if you notice, whether it is in the academic institutions or in any other public institutions, we refuse to talk about the tension between men and women and how exactly we negotiate this tension. Very often we tend to sort of overlook. We tend to think once we have come into the institutions, there is equality. But this is very disillusionment. There are a lot of disillusionment because when women, especially younger generation of women who come from first generation of families, confront caste discriminations, gender discriminations, and class differences. Now, isn't this not something where we need to talk about politics, how it exactly negotiates the position of women in various institutions? So this is where what we need to understand is, how did exactly women do in the past? What does history tell us? It doesn't just give us a list of women, Moovalur Rama Maratammal, Muthulakshmi Reddy, Subbulakshmi, and several others. They are not just sort of figures as heroines, but they are figures who had to negotiate. What did they negotiate? In 1917, for the first time, we have Women's India Association coming up in the Madras presidency. And they were the first one to raise vote for women, which looked very unique. Nobody wanted to listen to women, despite they were all educated, elite women, from Theosophical Society to Women's India Association. So when they represented to the British were somewhat taken aback, partly because their own women do not have voting right in their own country. Well-educated Western women until 1938. Now suddenly here are women who are asking for voting rights. And what is interesting also, first of all, Indian men did not have voting right in a substantial way. Only very few men with property rights, with some level of education, could think about representation. And here are women asking for voting rights. So what the government did in 1919, as you know, the Government of India Act, which came up, for the first time, talked about diarchy, where they thought Indian men should have representation. In all provincial assemblies can have substantial representation. But they didn't talk about women, because in the substantial representation, women cannot contest as legislators. Women at the most provincial assemblies can think about deliberating new legislation to nominate them for power. And this is where the Madras Presidency Justice Party plays a very important role. For the first time, probably all over the world, we have a government which decided to empower women through voting right. So Madras Presidency was the first government in 1921 to come up with the majority, almost 60% of men stood for voting right of women plus representation of women. So by 1926, you have Muthulakshmi Reddy getting nominated to the Madras presidency, Madras legislature. That is how the beginning of women's representation happens. Now, what is interesting is, of course, this is where the Dravidian model begins. And we know fully well that in 1928, it takes quite a, interestingly, the Congress party was not fully for it. Why it is so, I'll come to that. But what happens in 1928, Jawaharlal Nehru, for instance, he was the first one to say that once we endorse a self-government, then we have to take women's organizations' demand for universal adult suffrage, which means that sex equality has to be in the forefront of talking for, talking about adult suffrage. Now comes the Government of India Act 1935, where again what we find that the Government of India Act, one of the detailed first in Government of India Act, which even British Parliament thought is the longest in the history in terms of its provisions. It says very clearly, only widows and women with some property can vote. And others cannot. Other women who have been actively participating in the national movement, but they cannot vote. Now what happens here is, the women's organizations, All India Women's Conference protest, and very tellingly, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya says here, we do not think that women's right as a citizen should depend on her marriage. Now marriage becoming a kind of a status for women to be included in any kind of right issues in the public is something that's been disputed by the women's organization and not by the Congress party or by the nationalist movement. Why this is so? What is wrong with this fundamentally with the nationalism as such, as an ideology or even as a practice? We have to seriously think about it. Of course, I am not against celebrating 75 years of independence because women did contribute very, very significantly for our freedom movement. But much of the organized women's activities could not completely defy the national movement's ideology of women. This is where the problem begins. While the Justice Party went about implementing women's rights as women's rights, sex equality as fundamentally important in claiming representation, we find that the national movement is troubled by what is a woman as a political subject. Are women really a political subject? Or are they women who are meant for other kind of symbolism that the national movement requires? This is the debate. Now what happens here? Fundamentally, colonial government did not have much of an interest in reform for women per se. Whenever it introduced legislation for women, whether it is anti-sati or anti-child marriage or Widow Remarriage Act, what was the interest of the colonial government, British government? The British government thought that here are the Indian men who are not capable of ruling their own country. If they cannot even bring about reform for their women, their women are kept in a very low status, and that reveals the fundamentally emasculated status of men. And as you understand, for men, important status is their masculine identity, the warrior identity, the aggressiveness, control over everybody. But here are the British government trying to tell Indian men, you are not capable of ruling your country because your women are kept at a very low status. Now this is where is the political agenda of the national movement begins. What the Indian men did, they wanted to establish their own sovereignty over the colonial rule. How to go about it? When our women are ridiculed by the Western country and Western, colonial rulers. What they did, they wanted to claim a sovereignty for themselves. What they did, on the one level, they said, as well-known political scientist Partho Chatterjee, you must read his article on women's question in the national movement, which is a very important kind of intervention the political theorist makes. What is the argument here? That all nationalist leaders and social reformers included, male leaders, they thought women can have education. Women can have, to some extent, some employment possible. But fundamentally, women should be at home representing the authentic Indian culture. Indian motherhood is very important. Indian wifehood is very important. And the domestic sphere is where Indian men were enjoying their freedom, the space autonomous of the intervention of the British. And therefore, to obtain a kind of sovereignty, the domesticity is very important. So, what exactly was the articulation very clearly was, women can have education, women can travel outside to access employment, but fundamentally women have to be Indian mothers. And Indian motherhood is the symbolic way in which contestation took place. Except in Madras Presidency, the entire India opposed Catherine Mayo's important text, Mother India, the book which denigrated, according to nationalists, denigrated Indian men, denigrated Indian society. But what happened in Madras Presidency? The Dravidian movement and the non-Brahmin movement very clearly said, why are you talking about the imperial attitude of Catherine Mayo when you can see in the text there are truth. There are truth about how Indian men are treated by Indian men. Why are we still having child widows? Why are we still having sati? Why there is no widow remarriage? These are the questions that was raised by the Dravidian movement here. And they very clearly said, do not attribute imperialism to the text which is pointing out the condition of women. Now, by attributing imperialism to everything, you are fundamentally not able to address the human right, the women's right, as fundamental to liberation of the country. For the nationalists, it was liberation of the country which was important. The secondary was women's liberation. It is only after achieving the liberation of the country, you can talk about your own women. Our women, their women, and everybody's women. Now here, women becomes a subject, political subject, only to address the interest of the nation and not the interest of women. This is the problem. This is the problem within which women in India had to contend with nationalism, had to contend with new Indian state, which was never talking about the reservation for women. What happens in 1937, when reservation was actively talked about All India Women's Conference, the Constituent Assembly comes up in 1950, and where even the most radical men of the Congress did not think about reservation for women. They thought it is a collective decision that we give up any of these kind of separatist ideas of reservation. Now we know very well historically that it is only in the 1990s, in the late 1980s onwards, we are talking about reservation for women in the representative bodies. Now we know, and you know history on the whole, which is a very latest history, is that reservation for women has its own problems. While much of the feminist agenda has been that by giving reservation for women, there is a possibility that women can address women's interest, women's needs. There are separate needs for women, no? Fundamentally, what are the needs of women? Women's needs are not about taking care of children. Women's needs are not about motherhood. Women's needs are not only about family. Women's needs are education, employment, realizing their full freedom in the political, economic and social sphere. Now this cannot be confused with merely talking about the numerical representation of women. What is the idea of increasing number of women in parliament and in all other decision-making bodies? One of the important arguments that came up during the proposal for reservation by women's organization was that by claiming sexual equality, sex equality, and by claiming gender equality, it has to be very clear that in the decision-making bodies, women ought to be there in large number in order to press for women's perspective on other issues. It's not only women's needs. There is a special perspective for women about politics, which is not the same as men. How is that different perspective is there between women and men on politics? What could be the different perspective? I hope you can just think about it. You can even ask me this question. What is the gender differences in perspective about politics? The perspective about politics is different between men and women because as from 1980, the feminist movement in India and in the world on the whole has shown everything the way we live in our everyday life is about politics. Personal is political. Nothing is beyond, politics. It can be informal politics, it can be formal politics, it can be of many ways in which we can strategize. But personal is political. No one can escape this idea of personal is political. What did they mean by personal is political? How did the feminists articulate this idea of personal as political? They articulate it very clearly by saying that across the world, states take up legislation in favor of women. We know that women and women's issues do not escape the intervention by the state. We know the state is also a political institution. They make interventions. What do? They talked about reproductive rights for women. So what is the role of the feminist here? Feminists are saying, when you are talking about reproductive rights, are you talking about reproductive health of women? Or are you talking about population control, where you want to use women's bodies to control and regulate population, rather than talking about women's health? And you're talking about abortion right. We know that the United States has the very controversial legislations which has come under close criticism of the feminist. Because whenever the state wants a particular legislation on behalf of women, feminists are acutely aware that often it need not be taking care of women's interest. It has other interest. Why so? Because all states are patriarchal. It's not because men control the state. It is because the ideology in which the state institutions function are not something that is gender sensitive. If they have to be gender sensitive, they have to consult women. They have to consult women right from grassroots to the top officials to find out how exactly women respond. We know that several of the legislation brought out by the union government today does not consult any of the women's organizations. How are they coming up with abortion laws? How are they coming up about raising the age of child marriage? Have they consulted the women's organization? What is the democracy we are talking about if women are not substantially participating in the democracy? What is the nature of women's participation in the democracy today? Why this is so? What is it that is limiting the women's participation in the democracy? It's limiting because we know fully well any kind of right-wing politics has its own agenda of women's participation. I am not saying that it has discontinuity with what has happened in the past. Definitely, it has its own agenda of nationalism. And the Hindu nationalist agenda is to look at the way in which majoritarian Hindu male desire on what is the role of family, what is the role of heterosexuality, what is the role of children. Now, where is the women's participation here? As we know, even after several years of coming to power, that reservation bill has not been passed. What is the reason? We cannot generalize by saying that men are not in favor of reservation. That's too overgeneralized. That's very polemical to say all men are opposed to women's interest. We are very clearly seeing the ideological role of nationalism, and particularly of Hindu nationalism, in controlling and regulating women's participation. So women's participation has not been very easy in that sense within this kind of ideological orientation. Now, leaving aside ideology, we cannot talk about notional representation. A substantial representation of women can only come when there is ideological orientation towards women's participation. As we have seen right from 1921, it is only in Madras Presidency with Justice Party we have been able to do this. So in many ways, fundamentally, if at all women's representation have to happen, women's participation have to question the ideology of nationalism. No nationalism has ever empowered women. In fact, nationalism thrives on reification of women as mothers, but not seeing her individual rights. So fundamentally, these are very important to keep in mind when we talk about reservation and representation as such. Sorry if I am taking very long. Is it okay if I just finish in 5 minutes? Okay. Yeah. So the second aspect that I want to focus on is this idea when we talk about representation. The numerical representation, which is seen as a very important factor, tend to also push us towards a debate about male versus female interest. Rather than looking at how gender itself as a category, it's a very complex category. Nobody lives our life as merely as women or men in this society. We know fully well caste mediates our way of looking at ourselves and the way we look at others, the way we interact with each other, and the manner in which we advance a particular interest collectively in the political public. If this is so, it's very clear that a large number of OBC and Dalit women today, while they have a kind of a significant presence in politics, particularly at the grassroots level and at the panchayat level, we also know different forms of patriarchy control them. It renders them little vulnerable and not completely violent-free spaces. And they're also not completely empowered despite representation. And we know recently that Times of India has got this, I think 2 days back, about incapacity or incapability of panchayat women to function autonomous of their men. But what one is not understanding in a place like Tamil Nadu, which is very, very important to note, that right from 1996 onwards, wherever NGO and other political activism has happened, women's representation has been slow, steady, and they have made remarkable kind of inroad into panchayat politics. We have not had adequate studies to say that women are completely, disabled despite notional representation. They are very powerful enough to do wherever there has been women's political activism. So what is important is to strengthen women's political activism right from the grassroots level. And studies have very clearly tells us whether it is Gujarat, Karnataka. Karnataka has a long history of Panchayat Raj, 25 years, 30 years, and also maybe Kerala. What is clear from these studies is that women from the age of 25 to 40 have been able to actively contribute to Panchayat institutions. Why this is so? We know fully well women's public participation is hugely hindered by the huge responsibility in the domestic sphere. Childbearing, rearing is a major responsibility of women, irrespective of whichever the kind of policies that have come to come about, provided we give up. To me, really a folly, but we have to give up the idea of nationalism. The idea of Hindutva nationalism is what dividing us and not letting women come forward and take active participation in politics. Let me end it here. Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion, ma'am. நம்மோடு இந்த மாநாட்டிற்காக சிறப்புரை வழங்க மாண்புமிகு நாடாளுமன்ற உறுப்பினர் முனைவர் தமிழச்சி தங்கபாண்டியன் அவர்கள் வருகை புரிந்திருக்கிறார். அவர்களை அன்போடு மேடைக்கு அழைக்கிறோம். அவர்களோடு நம்முடைய தமிழ்நாடு திறந்தநிலை பல்கலைக்கழகத்தின் பதிவாளர் பேராசிரியர் ரத்னகுமார் ஐயா அவர்களையும் பேராசிரியர் எம் வி சுதாகரன் ஐயா அவர்களையும் நிகழ்வின் ஒருங்கிணைப்பாளர் முனைவர் அனந்தராமகிருஷ்ணன் ஐயா அவர்களையும் அன்போடு மேடைக்கு அழைக்கிறோம். நாடாளுமன்ற உறுப்பினர் அவர்களது சிறப்புரைக்கு பின்பாக மீண்டும் விவாதம் என்பது தொடரும். முனைவர் தமிழச்சி தங்கபாண்டியன் அவர்களுக்கு நீண்டதொரு அறிமுகம் தமிழகத்தில் தேவையில்லை என்றே கூறலாம். இருந்தாலும் விழாவிற்கென நேரம் ஒதுக்கி வருகை தந்தமைக்கு நன்றி கலந்த வணக்கத்தோடு அவரை பற்றிய சில அறிமுக குறிப்புகள். சென்னை ராணிமேரி கல்லூரியில் ஆங்கில விரிவுரையாளராக 12 ஆண்டுகள் பணிபுரிந்த மாண்புமிகு நாடாளுமன்ற உறுப்பினர் தமிழச்சி தங்கபாண்டியன் அவர்கள் ஆஸ்திரேலியாவில் புலம்பெயர்ந்து வாழ்கின்ற இலங்கை தமிழர்களது ஆங்கில படைப்புகளை, அந்த ஆக்கங்களை முன்வைத்து தன்னுடைய முனைவர் பட்டத்தை சென்னை பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் பெற்றுள்ளவர். விருதுநகர் மாவட்டம் மல்லாங்கிணறு என்னும் கிராமத்தில் பிறந்த இவர் தமிழச்சி என்னும் புனைப்பெயரில் பல கவிதைகளை எழுதி கொண்டு வருகிறார். இவரது கவிதைகள் சிறு பத்திரிகைகள், வெகுஜன பத்திரிகைகள் உள்ளிட்ட பல பத்திரிகைகளில் பிரசுரமாகியுள்ளன. பல்வேறு புத்தகங்களாகவும் வெளிவந்துள்ளன. பன்னாட்டு அரங்கங்களின் இலக்கிய நிகழ்வுகளிலும் பங்கு பெற்றிருக்கின்றார். ஆஸ்திரேலிய இந்திய கவுன்சில் என்னும் அமைப்பின் விருதான AIC ஃபெலோ 2002 என்னும் விருதினை பெற்று ஆஸ்திரேலியாவில் மோனாஸ் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் தனது கள ஆய்வை முடித்தவர் இவர். கரிசல் மண் மக்களது வாழ்க்கையினை பதிவு செய்திருக்கின்ற இவரது முதல் தொகுப்பான எஞ்சோட்டு பெண் என்னும் கவிதை நூலிற்கு கவிஞர் சிற்பி அறக்கட்டளை விருது 2004 வழங்கப்பட்டது. மகாகவி பாரதியார் அறக்கட்டளையின் கல்வியியல் விருதான மகாகவி பாரதியார் விருது 2005 ஆண்டு வழங்கப்பட்டிருக்கிறது. அதோடு நந்தனம் அரசு கலைக்கல்லூரி, லயலா கல்லூரி, எத்ராஜ் மகளிர் கல்லூரி மற்றும் ஸ்டெல்லா மேரஸ் கல்லூரியின் தமிழ் பட்ட படிப்பிற்கான பாடத்திட்டத்திலும் இவரது கவிதைகள், படைப்புகள் இணைக்கப்பட்டுள்ளன. தமிழச்சி அவர்களின் படைப்புகளில் பெண்ணிய சிந்தனைகள் எனும் தலைப்பில் இவரது படைப்புகள் குறித்து கொடைக்கானல் அன்னை தெரசா மகளிர் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் முனைவர் பட்ட ஆய்வேடுகள் சமர்ப்பிக்கப்பட்டுள்ளது குறிப்பிடத்தக்கது. இவரது 2வது கவிதை தொகுப்பு வனப்பேச்சி டிசம்பர் 2007 வெளியிடப்பட்டது. இந்த தொகுப்பிற்கு தமிழ்நாடு கலை இலக்கிய பெருமன்றத்தின் 7வது இலக்கிய விருது 2008 மற்றும் திருப்பூர் தமிழ்ச்சங்க விருது 2009 அளிக்கப்பட்டுள்ளன. தமிழ்நாடு அரசின் 2009 ஆண்டிற்கான பாவேந்தர் பாரதிதாசன் விருதினை இவருக்கு அளித்து கௌரவிக்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. 2010 ஆண்டிற்கான சிறந்த கவி ஆளுமை விருது இவருக்கு களம் புதிது இலக்கிய குழு சார்பாக வழங்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. கலைஞர் முத்தமிழ் அறிஞர் தலைவர் மு. கருணாநிதி அவர்களின் பொற்கிளி அறக்கட்டளையின் 2013 ஆண்டிற்கான சிறந்த கவிஞர் விருதும் வழங்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. பாரதியார் சங்கத்தின் 2015 ஆண்டிற்கான பாரதி பணிச்செல்வர் விருது வழங்கப்பட்டுள்ளது. அதனோடு 2017 விடியல் அறக்கட்டளையின் சார்பாக இவரது படைப்புத்திறன், பன்முக ஆற்றலை பாராட்டி பாரதி விருது அளிக்கப்பட்டது. இப்படி ஏராளமான விருதுகளை பட்டியலிட்டு கொண்டே செல்லலாம். என்றாலும் சுருக்கமாக பெண்களின் உரிமைகளுக்காக தனது எழுத்து, சொல் மூலம் செதுக்கப்பட்டு தற்போது அதற்கான செயலூக்கம் தருகிற வகையில் அனைவராலும் எளிதில் அணுகக்கூடிய வகையிலும் அனைவரது கருத்துக்களையும் உள்வாங்கிக் கொண்டு பன்முக குரலாக தமிழ்நாட்டின் ஒருமித்த குரலாகவும் இன்றைக்கு நாடாளுமன்றத்தில் ஒலித்துக் கொண்டிருக்கின்ற நம்முடைய தென்சென்னை தொகுதியின் நாடாளுமன்ற உறுப்பினர் அருமை சகோதரியும் மாண்புமிகு நாடாளுமன்ற உறுப்பினருமான தமிழச்சி தங்கபாண்டியன் அவர்களை மீண்டும் ஒரு முறை உங்களின் சார்பாகவும் குற்றவியல் மற்றும் குற்றநீதி நிர்வாகப்புலத்தின் சார்பாகவும் தமிழ்நாடு திறந்தநிலை பல்கலைக்கழகத்தின் சார்பாகவும் வரவேற்று இந்த மாநாட்டினை வாழ்த்தி சிறப்புரை வழங்குமாறு அவரை அன்போடு அழைக்கிறோம். நன்றி.
நன்றி. Dr. S. Anantha Ramakrishnan, who has delivered the welcome address. Professor M.V. Sudhakaran, Chairperson, Faculty of Social Sciences, must have given the rationale of this program. Professor K. Ratnakumar, Registrar, who must have given the felicitation address. Madam Minister, Honorable Geeta Jeevan, who could have addressed you and just left a while, Minister of Social Welfare and Empowerment. Dr. B. Anupama Devi, who is yet to deliver the vote of thanks, Assistant Professor of Social Studies, could be Women's Cell. And my dear panelists, Professor Anandi, Madras Institute of Development Studies, Professor S. Ramdas, Department of Criminology, University of Madras, and my dear own bosom friend, whom I respect and admire a lot, Kavita Muralidharan, journalist, all the faculty members and my dear students, எல்லாருக்கும் என்னுடைய அன்பான காலை வணக்கம். முதலில் இந்த நிகழ்ச்சிக்கு கிட்டத்தட்ட 1 மணி நேரம் தாமதமாக வந்ததற்கு என்னுடைய மனமார்ந்த மன்னிப்பை தெரிவித்துக் கொள்கின்றேன். முதலமைச்சர் அவர்களுடைய நிகழ்ச்சி ஒன்றில் காலை கலந்து கொள்ள வேண்டிய அந்த நிலைமை இருந்ததால் 1 மணி நேரம் தாமதமாக வந்தது என்பது உண்மையிலேயே எனக்கு வருத்தத்தை அளிக்கின்றது. அதற்காக உங்களிடம் என்னுடைய மன்னிப்பை தெரிவிக்கின்றேன். My sincere apologies. Whenever I step in the annals of any university or a college premises, my heart flutters and I do have butterflies in my stomach full of happiness, because as a former professor, I wouldn't like to use the word former professor. ஏனென்றால் ஆசிரிய பணிக்கும் மருத்துவ பணிக்கும் ஓய்வு என்பதே கிடையாது என்று நினைக்கின்றேன், நம்புகின்றேன். A teacher or a doctor never retires. It's not merely a profession, but it's just a way of life. ஆகவே எப்பொழுது ஒரு பல்கலைக்கழக அல்லது கல்லூரிக்குள் காலடி வைத்தாலும் மிகுந்த மகிழ்வான மனநிலையோடு நான் இருப்பேனோ அதுபோலவே இன்றும் உங்கள் முன்பாக நிற்கின்றேன். Of course, it is a breach of the protocol. A keynote address needs to be delivered in the beginning of all the proceedings, but still beckoning my condition, I would like to just share my thoughts. The tagline or the theme of the seminar here is women's participation, representation and empowerment. And of course, I stand before you as a walking example of a Karasalkattu Tamilachi from Mallanginaru. Mallanginaru என்கின்ற ஒரு தெற்கத்தி கிராமத்தின் வெயிலும் வெட்கையும் வீசுகின்ற ஒரு கிராமத்தில் மண்மெழுகிய தரையில் அமர்ந்து ஒன்னாப்பையும் மூணாப்பையும் படித்த ஒரு கரிசல்காட்டு தமிழச்சி இன்றைக்கு முனைவர் பட்டம் பெற்று உங்கள் முன்பாக உரையாடுகின்ற இந்த வாய்ப்பை, my participation, probably my representation, and to an extent an empowerment have given to me. But the question is, my dear students, how many of us have the luxury of this? நம்மள் எத்தனை பேருக்கு அல்லது இன்னமும் எத்தனை பேருக்கு எனக்கு கிடைத்த இந்த வாய்ப்பு கிடைத்து இந்த மாதிரியான மேடைகளும் இது மாதிரியான ஏணிப்படிகளில் ஏறுகின்ற வாய்ப்பும் இருக்கின்றது? I believe that is the main question of which all our dear panelists were addressing here, they would be discussing also, and maybe the theme of the conference. குறிப்பாக பெண்களுக்கு சமூகத்தில் எப்படி பங்கு பெறுவது, தங்களை எப்படி அவர்கள் வெளிப்படுத்திக் கொள்வதோடு சமூகத்திற்கான அந்த ஆழ்ந்த பிரச்சனைகளிலும் அவர்கள் தங்களை ஈடுபடுத்திக் கொள்வது, அதனோடு இணைந்து தாமும் விடுதலையும் சுதந்திரமும் உரிமையும் பெறுவது, இதைத்தான் ஒரு நோக்கமாக கருத்தரங்கம் பெண்களிடையே கொண்டு செல்ல விரும்புகிறது. அது குறித்து தான் அத்தனை பேரும் இங்கே விவாதிக்கிறோம் என்று நான் நினைக்கின்றேன். And this is a very special seminar because we are commemorating our Independence Day celebrations by celebrating womanhood, feminist principles, and by gauging over the need for women's participation, representation and empowerment with all the jargons within the quotes attached to it. But as the panelist Professor Anandi was just sharing her thoughts just before I came to the dais, do all these words really mean to whoever is on the power? Or what are the obstacles for women, especially the young teenage students as well, those who are on the rural side? What are these jargons actually mean? Does the patriarchy accept women really to participate, represent, and being an empowered human being? Those are the key questions of which everybody needs to address. These three concepts or ideas, I feel, are intrinsically linked to each other. They cannot be mutually exhaustive ever, and more so when we talk about it from a feminist point of view. A similarity between these three things is that all of them are collective in nature. When one woman participates in the public sphere, she sets an example for 10 more women who look forward to her as an inspiration. When I was feeling little uncomfortable when our dear friend was reading a little bit of long elaborative introduction about me, professor next to me was just consoling, saying that it might be an inspiration to all the youngsters. That's why we just wanted to read out, though it creates a little bit of uncomfortable feeling to me. So she sets an example for 10 more women who look forward to her as an inspiration. She knowingly or unknowingly motivates other women, helping gather the strength and courage to participate in the public sphere. Her participation becomes a matter of representation of what constitutes half of this world, women. And collectively, it's a first step for any government or any social organization which advocates for empowerment of the entire community to take these things very seriously. Audre Lorde, a famous feminist scholar, rightly once said, "I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." அதுதான் ரொம்ப ரொம்ப முக்கியமான ஒன்று. இன்று நான் இந்த இடத்திற்கு மல்லாங்கிணரிலிருந்து இந்த இடத்திற்கு ஏறி வருவதற்கான இந்த படிக்கட்டுகளை என்னால் ஓரளவு அதிகமான சிரமமின்றி கடக்க முடிந்தது என்றால் அது மாதிரியான இலகுவும் வசதியும் வாய்ப்பும் இந்த சமூகம் சாதிய கட்டுப்பாடு அல்லது நம் மீது திணிக்கப்படுகின்ற பெண் குறித்த பொதுமையான கருத்துக்கள் அல்லது நம்முடைய இடுப்பின் மீதும் தலையின் மீதும் சுமத்தி வைக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்ற இன்ஸ்டிடியூஷன்ஸ், மதம், திருமணம், இவை போன்ற அத்தனை அந்த கட்டமைப்புகள் இவை எல்லாம் தாண்டி as all of us, most of the people who are actually interested in liberation of women, the word, like the nationalism which is being given as a sugar-coated capsule, as a sugar-coated medicine, all these endangering words, they just dance before me as I just repeat the quote of Audre Lorde. I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. But it's unfortunate to know some distressing figure while we celebrate our 75th independence with all the gala, with all the pride. It's very disturbing also to see some statistics. According to Global Gender Gap Report 2021, India has declined on the political empowerment index by 13.5 percentage points, and there is also a decline in the number of women ministers from 23.1% in 2019 to 9.1% in 2021. India ranks 20th from the bottom in terms of representation of women in parliament, and this is not surprising. We have heard the panelists just wondering about what has happened to the women representation bill. The whole nation witnessed how many obstacles the bill faced, and still, like we have to face so many hurdles. Take the case of the landmark Women's Representation Bill, which is a long pending one and till date has not been passed, irrespective of several regime changes in India. And it's a long history, not only with that bill. Whenever a woman or women with liberated ideas try to make an inroad into any other already established institutions or organizations or any other ideas or principles which were taught to us or which were just given to us, this is how a woman or a woman should be, then there is always a problem even regarding the policy. And you must have witnessed recently in USA the anti-abortion law. So a nation which is supposed to be so progressive, a nation which welcomes everybody from any other corner of the world, a nation which is supposed to be the pioneer in so many other fields, why should it has to bring such a regressive law at the 22nd century, which really, kicks a very, very alarming question in all of us. But I personally, as well as a parliamentarian also, feel that the fate of Women's Reservation Bill is somewhat a product of patriarchal values that continue to marginalize women. We have marginal communities everywhere, but that one community which is marginalized universally is, I would say, women. And when there was a little discussion on this women reservation bill, which is off the record, I was just sharing it with some of my fellow parliamentarians that we want 50% reservation because we are half of the population. And that what I received was just a smirk. That was the response. While I talk about women, I also wish to broaden the spectrum and our understanding of gender further to see how our LGBTQIA plus community members have faced a similar set of de-recognition in the legislature. Why I am bringing this in this particular topic is we always have this idea that when we talk about women, this section of people are completely put on the sidelines and nobody is talking actually about them. It has to be all inclusive. At this age, it is not enough to talk about women alone. When we talk about gender, we need to be vocal about all gender-based marginalized identities. Recently, 3 crucial legislations have been passed in the parliament which curtail the rights of LGBTQI persons. These are a set of sections under the Surrogacy Regulation Act 2021, Assisted Reproductive Technology Regulation Act 2021, and the Medical Terminal of Pregnancy Amendment Act 2021, which are anti-LGBTQI. I raised this issue in Parliament also and urged the Union government to withdraw all these things. That is the stand of our party, and I just represented those things. So I talked about women's participation in the legislature just now as a woman parliamentarian, but let me also just give an insight to all the other little bit of different fields where due to structural and institutional gender-based hierarchies, we see the low levels of women representation and participation. Let me come to your own department. Let me begin by judiciary. In high courts, the percentage of women judges is a mere 11.5%, while in the Supreme Court there are 4 sitting women judges out of 33 in office. Shocking indeed. These are the figures of India 2022, when India had massive pompous celebrations celebrating the 75 years of freedom. But seeing how out of 1.7 million advocates registered, only 15% are women. Women still need to be given their right to representation in order to be free in the real sense. Let's look at the field of medicine. In India, even when women constituted 51% of the students joining medical colleges in 2014 to 15, there is a serious shortage of female doctors in India. Only 17% of doctors in India are women, according to a Lancet study. This is less than one female allopathic doctor per 10,000 population in rural areas. Further, according to 2020 United Nations report, Indian women scientists are only 14% of the 280,000 scientists, engineers and technologists employed in research institutions in the country. This is much less than the global proportion of women, which is 30% amongst the world's scientific researchers. My dear students, this is not just a boring statistics, because there is a temperament. When, like somebody presents a statistics, there is a temperament, there is a tendency just to, like, what are we going to do with these figures? But it's high time we have to take seriously, not only my women students here, but also the male students, because without whom the representation, participation and empowerment is not totally possible. It is when a man understands a woman properly, it is when a man considers her as an individual, not merely as a mother or a wife or carrying so many other responsibilities. It is when a man recognizes the need to empower her as a total, wholesome personality, real change in the society can happen. The lack of women's representation across all major professional fields, I have just shared it with you. But now specifically coming to your area, the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice Administration at this university, I think most of you would already be aware of the state of criminal justice for women in India. When the Crime in India 2020 report mentioned that crimes against women decreased between 2019 and 2020, all of us welcomed it. Bravo, we said. But let me have a word of caution here. These statistics only show the number of reported cases. To be able to report a crime for a woman in India is still a big nightmare. This is where I think all of us should help a woman who is in need of it through either to counseling or by listening or just, like cheering her up, giving her courage to come out and speak, because it's still a big nightmare. A Herculean task which she can achieve only by crossing several barriers of being stigmatized, of being questioned, and of being discouraged by this very system which pretends to support women. And the NCRB statistics are of the time when this country and this world was under the biggest lockdown in history. We can't just take the statistics for granted. We have to just fix it. In which context was it taken? This welcoming statistics which denotes a decrease was taken during the lockdown, and was it true? How could women then be able to report what happened inside their own homes? That's a very, very important question. Anyhow, cases of domestic violence are one of the least reported cases, and we all know why. A renowned feminist, academician and scholar, Patricia Oberoi, rightly said that family is also a site of exploitation and violence. But familiar relationships are not subjected to scrutiny, since they are considered as sacred and hence unquestionable. And women as well as men need to question that also. Now coming again to the NCRB report, which hailed a decrease in crime against women during 19 to 20, a time of the global pandemic, I want to highlight the facts that the UN has highlighted. It said that the situation of women during the pandemic was so bad that they declared a shadow pandemic. I don't know how many of us are aware of this phrase. which was simultaneously going on along with the COVID-19 pandemic. That shadow pandemic was a silent one, where women were facing the brunt of being locked down. It was a time when the pandemic reached our doors, but the gruesome reality behind the doors was unchecked. In a situation where women are threatened of even greater abuse on reporting, the helplines during the global pandemic received a consistently high number of emergency help calls, marking an increase when compared to the non-pandemic times. There has been an increase in calls by more than 33% and 30% in countries like Singapore and Cyprus, respectively. And imagine the case of our own country then. In France, cases of domestic abuse increased by more than 30%. The cruelty and danger of reporting were so extreme that in France and Spain, a code word called Mask 19. How many of you are aware of this? I'm not sure. But this was, at that time, passed on to the women all over the world. A code word called Mask 19 was developed by women to inform the nearby pharmacists about the domestic abuse, who further contacted the authorities. And how many of those crimes were reported, and how many of those unheard voices of women were heard during those times? That's a very important question. The National Commission for Women in India recorded a more than twofold rise in gender-based violence amidst COVID-19 lockdown. But nobody spoke about this shadow pandemic, and women were not aware of this particular code word or whatever it is. As the whole world, the rest of the world was taking and talking also things seriously and talking about women's plight seriously. Situation was more silent and much more dumb and numb in our country. Women's education suffered the most during pandemic. That's a very, again, also a very interesting social factor in that. The UNICEF report of 2017 mentioned that only 29% of users are females in India. The much celebrated Digital India, 27% of mobile users. The much celebrated Digital India campaign by the Union government seriously ignored the gender gap in society. Even when women students who have access to some amount of internet, they still remain unable to access online classes due to unequal burden of work at home and often clashing with household chores. Women using mobile phones constantly for hours is still considered a taboo here in society and looked with suspicion. It was not long back that panchayats banned phones from being used by girls going to colleges in areas of rural India. There is what I see as an undeclared timing till which she can use phones or laptops. It's there, and even in homes and houses. Her mind remains preoccupied with thoughts of regarding what would family members or colleagues or friends assume if she sticks to that phone, even for studying. One of the greatest feminist scholars of our times, Virginia Woolf, of whom I really admired, once talked about a room for one's own, for women to devote themselves to academics. தனக்கென ஒரு அறை இருப்பது என்பது ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய கனவாக இன்றும் இந்தியாவில் இருக்கின்ற, குறிப்பாக கிராமப்புறங்களிலே இருக்கின்ற பெண்களுக்கு எட்டாத கனவாக, வீடு என்பதே மிகப்பெரிய கனவு என்னும் பொழுது அந்த வீட்டில் தனக்கென்று ஒரு அறை விரும்புகின்ற பெண்கள் மிக 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 அதிகம் நம்முடைய வீட்டிலே. I just wanted to narrate a personal anecdote, and then I would like to end my speech with that. It's a different story of women's participation probably in cities and in urban areas when compared to the rural areas. நான் பிறந்து வளர்ந்த மல்லாங்கனரில் கோமதி அக்கான்னு ஒரு அக்கா இருப்பாங்க. கோமதி அக்கா கல்யாணம் பண்ணி பக்கத்து ஊருக்கு போய் ஒரு 25 வருஷம் ஆச்சு. 25 வருஷத்துலையும் இந்த பொங்கல் பண்டிகையில் போகி பண்டிகை இருக்கு இல்லைங்களா, அந்த போகி பண்டிகைக்கு மட்டும் எங்கள் ஊருக்கு வருவாங்க. கல்யாணமான புதுசில் வந்து இந்த தைப்பொங்கலுக்கு இருந்திருக்கலாம், அவங்களுடைய வாக்கப்பட்ட வீட்டுக்கு போயிருக்கலாம். ஆனால் தொடர்ச்சியாக 25 வருஷமும் வந்து இந்த போகி பண்டிகைக்கு மட்டும் வந்துட்டு தைப்பொங்கலுக்கு அவங்களோட ஹஸ்பண்ட் வீட்டுக்கு போயிடுவாங்க. பக்கத்து ஊர் தான், 4-8 நடந்து வச்சா போயிடலாம். இப்போ ஒரு தடவை நான் கேட்டேன் கோமதி அக்காட்ட, ஏன் எப்போ பார்த்தாலும் வெறும் போகி பண்டிகைக்கு மட்டும் நம்ம ஊருக்கு வர்றக்கா, ஒரு நாள் கூட பொங்கலில் இருக்கிறதுல? அதான் 25 வருஷம் ஆச்சு இல்லை, நிறைய திருவிழா அது இங்கே நடக்கும், நீ இருக்கலாம்லன்னு. அந்த அக்கா அப்போ சொல்லுச்சு, வாக்கப்பட்ட வீட்டில் எல்லாத்தையுமா கொளுத்திட முடியுது? கல்யாணம் பண்ணி போன வீட்டில் எல்லாத்தையுமா கொளுத்திட முடியுது? அந்த சுதந்திரம் கூட அந்த அக்கா கிடையாது. எதையாவது பழச கழிச்சு கொளுத்தணும் என்னன்னா கூட அது கூட கிடையாது. அதுக்கு அவங்க அம்மா வீட்டுக்கு வந்து எதெல்லாம் கொளுத்தணும்னு நினைக்கிறாங்களோ, இட்ஸ் எ மெட்டஃபாரிக்கல் சென்ஸ். அந்த கேள்வி என்னை தொடர்ச்சியாக துன்பப்படுத்திய கேள்வி. இன்றளவும் அந்த கேள்வி மிகப்பெரிய கொஸ்டின் when it comes to participation, representation and empowerment. இந்த 3 வார்த்தைகளும் இந்தியாவில் குறிப்பாக நம்முடைய அந்த கிராமப்புற பெண்களை எந்த அளவில் சேர்ந்திருக்கின்றன, இவை என்ன அர்த்தத்தை தருகின்றன? நிறைய கரிசல் காட்டு பெண்கள், நிறைய கிராமப்புற பெண்கள் தங்களுடைய சுயமரியாதை, தன் கால்களில் நிற்கின்ற அந்த பலத்தினால் வாழ்வு குறித்து பெரிதாக ஒரு பராதிகள், கம்ப்ளைண்ட்ஸ் இல்லாமல் நிறைய அவங்க காலே நிற்கிற பெண்கள் நான் பார்த்துருக்குறேன். அவங்களோட வளர்ந்துருக்கேன் நான். அவங்களுக்கே கூட இந்த அரசியல் அதிகாரம் என்பது இன்னமும் எட்டாத கனியாகத்தான் இருக்கிறது. Why should a woman has to move to that particular space and why do we need political power? Because முடிவுகள் எடுக்கின்ற இடத்தில் பெண்கள் இருக்கும் பொழுது அவர்களுக்கான விஷயங்களை அவர்கள் மிக ஆணித்தரமாக தெளிவாக வைக்க முடியும். 10 மனிதர்களுடைய கண்களை விட ஒரு பெண்ணின் இதயம் அதிகம் பார்க்கிறது என்று சொல்லப்படுவது இதனால் தான். So it's my pleasure to have addressed you here. And again, I would go back to my favorite Audre Lorde. Moon marked and touched by sun, my magic is unwritten, but when the sea turns back, it will leave my shape behind. The shape which will be left behind would be the efforts of you, me and every woman who has shown undeterred strength and resilience to make their mark. Here, the panelists also, these are women, you know, like who have made a difference in their own personality as well as make inroads, certain inroads in this society also. Taking such women as example, I still have hope and it's a long journey to go. My heart goes out to all of us and we will continue this fight for greater representation of women and more participation and empowerment for all of us. Nandri, thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was really an inspiration and, of course, very informative keynote address for all of us. On behalf of Tamil Nadu Open University and the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice Administration, I render my gratitude to you, ma'am. And now I invite our registered